on Plugged In, 75 years later, D-Day, when Allied forces launched a massive naval, air, and land assault to liberate Europe from the shackles of Nazi Germany. Historians agree the Allied invasion marked the turning point that led to the end of the Second World War. With conflicts still raging around the world today, and as survivors of the largest military operation fade into history, what lessons have we learned? Hello, welcome to Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren. June 6, 1944, the day that changed the course of history, the invasion of Normandy, codenamed Operation Overlord. It marked the beginning of the end of the Second World War. More than 160,000 Allied troops landing on multiple beachheads in France. The mission? Liberating Europe from German Nazi occupation. Plugged In's Millar Sega has more.
From above, Normandy Beach in northern France shows little evidence of the military operation that took place here. But the memory of D-Day is forever etched in the landscape, in the monuments, in the white crosses that bear witness to the elaborate military undertaking 75 years ago.
It took years to plan it. There were probably thousands of maps, thousands of decisions made. It was incredibly complicated. I'm not sure that we could repeat it today with all the technology that we have. We got to remember these men did this without GPS, without the internet.
Never in military history has any campaign been so long anticipated, so much discussed, so thoroughly organized as the Second Front.
More remarkable was the secrecy and coordination to establish and defend 5 beachheads in heavily fortified enemy territory. The Americans landing on Utah and Omaha Beach, the British on Gold and Sword Beach, and Canadian troops on Juno.
A landing was made this morning on the coast of France by troops of the Allied Expeditionary Force.
But the casualties were heavy. By the time German forces retreated on August 30th, over 425,000 Allied and German troops had been killed, wounded, or missing. An additional 200,000 German soldiers were captured. At the American cemetery in Colleville-sur-Mer, many locals are grateful 75 years later.
C'est comme si c'était hier, c'est l'histoire de notre famille, de moi, mes grands-parents.
It is like yesterday. It is the story of my family, of my grandparents. And today, I know the price for my freedom. Without these young men buried here, I do not know who I would be.
The memorial at Omaha Beach attracts about 1 million visitors each year. People from around the world who come to pay tribute to those who sacrifice their lives for future generations.
That so many good men gave their lives for freedom means a lot to us, and to come here and to be able to take it in personally is just a very emotional experience.
Against withering fire from well-concealed German emplacements, only the highest courage and determination could avail.
3/4 of a century later, D-Day stands as the largest amphibious military operation ever attempted. But as the world grows increasingly complicated and former alliances fray, many wonder if such a massively coordinated mission could succeed today. Even as military leaders prepare for future conflicts, many hope the need for such a sacrifice never comes again. For Nicholas Pinault, Millar Sega, VOA News.
75 years after that heroic military operation, time is now running out for the surviving heroes of D-Day. According to the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, in 2018, fewer than 500,000 of the 16 million Americans who served in World War II were alive. And on average, we are losing about 350 World War II vets each day. VOA's Kane's Fireball has been fortunate to hear some of their stories, and during a recent visit to a war museum in New Orleans, Kane spoke to a former World War II bomber pilot about the impact of D-Day.
You were a fighter pilot?
No. B-24.
Champ Vinay,
I'll be 97 in a month,
vividly remembers June 6th, 1944, D-Day.
We knew it was coming. We didn't know when, of course.
Vinay was training to become a bomber pilot when Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy in the largest military invasion in history. But the drumbeats of war came to New Orleans long before.
What World War II did for my area the lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans was create jobs. We're talking about coming out of a depression where unemployment was 15 to 20, and Higgins created a huge amount of jobs.
New Orleans businessman Andrew Higgins was part of the pre-war U.S. arsenal of democracy, supplying equipment to America's allies. When the U.S. entered the fight in 1941, his factories equipped the military with a vessel critically important to the D-Day invasion.
In the immortal words of Dwight Eisenhower, this was how we won the war. Without those Higgins boats, there was no way that we could put 156,000 troops onto the beaches of Normandy.
Keith Huxton is a senior director at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, located where many of the Higgins boats were built.
This was New Orleans' great contribution to that war effort.
A contribution repaid in 2000 when the National D-Day Museum opened to highlight the Crescent City's role in the war effort. But some veterans who visited felt the museum needed more.
You have to expand the story. You have to include all of the American experience in World War II, why it was fought, how it was won, what it means today.
The National D-Day Museum transformed into the National World War II Museum in 2004. And now occupies a campus that continues to grow in a $400 million expansion. Over 700,000 people visit each year.
I do not believe that our museum romanticizes World War II. We try to show the realities, and the realities are pain and death and suffering for large parts of the world.
Champ Vinay flew a number of missions in Europe during World War II as a bomber pilot. He is now part of a dwindling number from the greatest generation.
Do you know how much people like you bombed, killed?
Yeah.
Passing along their stories.
The accuracy wasn't too well.
Which Vinay recently started doing as a museum volunteer.
As you get older, and in my case, very old, the possibility of you going soon is right there. It's real. And people want to talk about it now. I want to spread the word out firsthand before I leave.
Vinay feels a sense of duty, sharing stories of what he lived through.
It went almost 300 miles an hour.
And what was lost.
Oh, maybe it'll help prevent it happening again. Of course, war has changed. It won't happen that way, but World War II, life was cheap. We lost people by the millions.
A message that resonates with visitors to this museum, which memorializes a war that General Dwight Eisenhower called a great and noble crusade.
VOA's Midwest correspondent Kane Faribault has produced 2 Emmy Award-winning documentaries about the more than 16 million Americans who served in the Second World War. Kane joins us now on Skype from the state of Illinois. Nice to see you, Kane. And tell me, in terms of talking to these vets, there's so few who are left. What do you learn?
Well, I think the most important lesson that we learned from them is that what they participated in was something that most of them did willingly. They all felt like it was their duty. It was important for them to make the sacrifice to join the military, to fight in what Dwight Eisenhower called a great and noble crusade. And they did so without complaining. They did so without protest. And many of them paid the ultimate sacrifice in the defense of democracy and in fighting for their country. And for those that are living, many of them want to make sure that we all remember those who lost their lives in participating in this great war.
I'm of the age where a lot of my friends' fathers were actually in World War II and came back. Some of them may even have been in D-Day. But they didn't start speaking about it, it seems, until later. It seems like many of them just came back and started their lives.
That's right. I mean, a lot of them. So actually, one of the men that I profiled in one of my documentaries, John Am, he actually liberated 3 or 4 of the concentration camps in Germany, and lived for 60 years as a farmer on a farm in Pontiac, Illinois, here in the heartland. And he didn't talk at all about his experience in the war. It wasn't until I had talked to his son, who's a friend of mine, and I realized that he was in his 90s, he was still living, and he had this important story in which he was at the tip of the spear of the Allied invasion into Germany. And he had never really sort of relayed his experience to his own children about what he had seen and what he had witnessed. And I felt that we needed to seize the opportunity while we could in order for his children, at least, to understand what their father had been through. And in doing so, he remarkably remembered everything in such clarity. And I think what really happened, though, aside from the personal experience I have in talking to Sergeant John Am, Steven Spielberg's movie Saving Private Ryan, which came out in 1998, really sparked this interest in many people who weren't a part of that generation to ask questions of those who participated in it. And I think that really is where it began, this process of us exploring, memorializing, and portraying what all these men witnessed and women witnessed and experienced.
Well, I think, I know you've been to Normandy, I've been to Normandy, but there's just no way to explain. I mean, you really should, people, if they have the opportunity, should go to Normandy to see what those men endured, even in the worst of conditions.
It's the cost of war. I mean, this is the price of freedom. When you're walking amongst those white crosses in that cemetery in Colville-sur-Mer in France, the Normandy American Military Cemetery, this is exactly what it means to protect and defend and fight for your country. And these are the people that paid, the ultimate sacrifice. And, during World War II, we must remember that, the military was a segregated military. But the one interesting thing, when you're walking amongst those crosses in that cemetery, those soldiers are buried where they fell. There's no segregation in the cemetery. All of the soldiers, regardless of rank, nationality, race, religion, they're all buried together in the same cemetery.
Kane, thank you. VOA Midwest correspondent Kane Faribault. In the 75 years since D-Day, the U.S. has relied on strong and willing allies to back up and join with American military power. In recent times, some have begun to question the strength of America's influence and commitment to its allies. In April of this year, NATO, the alliance that grew out of D-Day in World War II, marked its 70th birthday. The U.S. is warning this 29-nation alliance that the greatest challenge today comes from cyberspace connectivity and China. Here is VOA diplomatic correspondent Cindy Sain.
For 70 years now, NATO has primarily been focused on the military threat posed by first the Soviet Union and then Russia. But Secretary of State Mike Pompeo warned that new threats are emerging, singling out China. He said the U.S. can compete with fair business competition, with better products and better ideas. But he said that is not what is going on with China and its telecommunication giants.
It is a very different thing to engage in transactions that have a national security component to them. When a nation shows up and offers you goods that are well below market, one ought to ask what else is at play, why it was that entity showed up with a deal that is literally too good to be true.
Vice President Mike Pence agreed, saying the challenge of easy money from China is something European allies must contend with every day.
China's expanding influence will necessarily demand more of America's attention and resources. And as we meet that challenge, our European allies must do more to maintain the strength and deterrence of our transatlantic alliance with their resources.
Some analysts say China has not overtaken Russia as a threat to NATO yet because Russia poses a tangible military threat to several of NATO's smaller members. But Beijing is a real concern.
It's certainly trying to divide and conquer and sort of spread its influence on the European continent, but not in the same way that Russia has been. I should also add that Russia is meddling in European and American politics in terms of hacking and the spread of disinformation and sort of what they call hybrid warfare. And China hasn't really undertaken the same sort of strategies at the same level as the Russians have.
NATO foreign ministers vowed to work together to adapt to evolving threats in the decades to come. Cindy Sain, VOA News, the State Department.
VOA Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb joins me. She has just returned from the Shangri-La Dialogue Security Summit in Singapore, where she spoke with acting U.S. Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan, who has said that China is his main concern. Nice to see you.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Before we get to your trip, I want to talk about NATO and the collective defense part about NATO, where all the countries are NATO agree to defend each other. What is sort of the status or the strength of NATO today?
Well, any member of NATO will still say the same thing they've said year after year after year. The alliance has never been stronger. There has been some issues with the alliance, particularly on financial issues. As we've heard, President Donald Trump has been calling for all of the NATO members to give their 2% that they actually agreed to during the Obama administration. Now, they have a few years to do so, but a lot of them haven't been kind of escalating at the pace that they could hit the mark. And so President Trump is calling them out, saying, there's billions upon billions of dollars there that could be used for defense. Why is the United States paying for your defense? And so there has been a response to that, and you're seeing more and more people contribute. But there's still some people that are withholding. Germany is a big one of those. Canada, I think Italy is another one of those that are not quite up there and would have to contribute several billion more dollars to get to that percentage point. But aside from that, when you look at the core value of NATO, to fight against a communist threat, to counter Russia, it's going pretty well. They work together all the time. There's actually going to be a big exercise June 9th, ball tops, where they'll be exercising in the region with primarily maritime, but there'll be all sorts of different exercises going on. And that's to show that the United States and its allies in Europe and Canada are united as ever.
All right, now I'm going to switch to the other part of the globe. You just traveled with the acting Secretary of Defense. You were in Singapore. And he has identified China as the problem. There's no sort of NATO in China, so to speak. What's the status of what's going on in China vis-a-vis the United States in military action?
Well, it's funny that you said there's no NATO in China, because I think if the United States had its way, Europe would be more involved in Asia. I think the United States is working is looking towards its allies in Europe to make this not just a U.S.-China battle, but to make this a China versus the world. And so you've seen the United States.
That brings in NATO.
Oh, yeah, and that brings in NATO. And you've seen that Britain, France, they've conducted freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. So I think if the United States has its way, you're going to see more of that in the future. And in the meantime, the United States has very strong alliances across Asia.
To deal with cyber security issues as well?
Well, that's a big topic of the conversation at the Shangri-La Dialogues. Acting Secretary of Defense Shanahan, he has not had his confirmation hearing yet, he spoke out against Huawei. And he said, I can't trust Huawei. I can't see that being that tied to the Chinese government. And I can't use that for civilian things, because I believe that the Chinese government will use that to spy on the United States and its allies. And so if you want to have intelligence sharing with the United States, you need to buy your communications appropriately.
Carla Babb, thank you very much. She's our Pentagon correspondent here at Voice America, just traveling with the acting Secretary of Defense. Few have spoken as eloquently or as persuasively about the importance of American leadership and the value of international coalitions as our 40th president, President Ronald Reagan. In this excerpt from his D-Day anniversary speech in 1984, that's 40 years after D-Day, President Reagan talked about the commitment and the resolve of the young men who stormed the beaches of Normandy.
40 summers have passed since the battle that you fought here. You were young the day you took these cliffs. Some of you were hardly more than boys with the deepest joys of life before you. Yet you risked everything here. Why? Why did you do it? Well, what impelled you to put aside the instinct for self-preservation and risk your lives to take these cliffs? What inspired all the men of the armies that met here? We look at you and somehow we know the answer. It was faith and belief. It was loyalty and love. The men of Normandy had faith that what they were doing was right, faith that they fought for all humanity, faith that a just God would grant them mercy on this beachhead or on the next. It was the deep knowledge, and pray God we have not lost it, that there is a profound moral difference between the use of force for liberation and the use of force for conquest. You were here to liberate, not to conquer, and so you and those others did not doubt your cause. When the war was over, there were lives to be rebuilt and governments to be returned to the people. There were nations to be reborn. Above all, there was a new peace to be assured. These were huge and daunting tasks, but the Allies summoned strength from the faith, belief, loyalty, and love of those who fell here. They rebuilt a new Europe together. There was first a great reconciliation among those who had been enemies, all of whom had suffered so greatly. The United States did its part, creating the Marshall Plan to help rebuild our allies and our former enemies. The Marshall Plan led to the Atlantic Alliance, a great alliance that serves to this day as our shield for freedom, for prosperity, and for peace. We in America have learned bitter lessons from 2 world wars. It is better to be here ready to protect the peace than to take blind shelter across the sea, rushing to respond only after freedom is lost. We've learned that isolationism never was and never will be an acceptable response to tyrannical governments with an expansionist intent. We're bound today by what bound us 40 years ago, the same loyalties, traditions, and beliefs. We're bound by reality. The strength of America's allies is vital to the United States, and the American security guarantee is essential to the continued freedom of Europe's democracies. We were with you then, we're with you now. Your hopes are our hopes, and your destiny is our destiny. Here in this place, where the West held together, let us make a vow to our dead. Let us show them by our actions that we understand what they died for. Let our actions say to them the words for which Matthew Ridgway listened: I will not fail thee nor forsake thee. Strengthened by their courage, heartened by their value, and borne by their memory, let us continue to stand for the ideals for which they lived and died. Thank you very much, and God bless you all.
Historians have studied D-Day, including lessons learned. Among them, our next guest, Craig Simons. He is a distinguished professor of maritime history at the Naval War College, professor emeritus at the U.S. Naval Academy, and an award-winning author of 29 books, including Operation Neptune and World War II at Sea. He joins us on Skype from the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. Thank you for joining us, Professor.
Good morning, Greta.
Professor, sort of put into one sort of description of how difficult this was, taking account of the weather, the geography, the secrecy, the magnitude of how many people were involved in actually performing this heroic battle, and your thoughts about it.
Well, you've summarized it pretty well in that question, and that is to say it's the largest amphibious undertaking, the largest military undertaking in the history of organized warfare. And it's easier, I think, 75 years after the fact, to come to the conclusion that somehow this all worked out in neat, pre-planned packages and that success was inevitable. But the alliance that conducted this was often as fragmented and as at odds with one another as some of your previous speakers have suggested is true these days. There was argument between the British and the Americans about the timing of it. The Russians, of course, wanted it to happen immediately because they were hard-pressed, their backs almost literally to the wall facing the Wehrmacht. The British, however, who'd been driven off the beach at Dunkirk, were not quite as much of a hurry to get back in as the Americans, impatient as always, who wanted to invade in 1943. I think if the British had had their way, they might have waited till 1945. So there was give and take and understanding and disagreement among the Allies at the time. And yet people of goodwill managed to find compromise, find solutions, and get it all done.
Was it truly secret? Did the Germans not know this was coming?
The Germans certainly knew an invasion was coming. That was not any kind of secret at all. The question was when and where. And of course, there are a lot of stories that people are almost familiar now about the deception, Operation Fortitude, that the British put on to try to deceive the Germans with fake radio announcements and artificial and false camps, even inflatable tanks located in East Anglia, to try to convince the Germans the invasion would take place someplace else, particularly at the Pas de Calais. So the Germans knew it was happening. They weren't sure when. And I think the biggest element of surprise was that the Allies launched this in particularly difficult weather. So as tough as it was, for the Allies to cross that channel in that horrible weather. It was also a bit of a cover for them.
You know, in doing some of my research for this, obviously at the time of D-Day, the United States had a segregated military, African-American and white military. It wasn't until about 1948 that President Truman signed the executive order unifying the military. But there was a balloon brigade that was led by African-Americans. What was the significance of that in World War II? Or in that battle?
Well, the whole relationship, I think, between white and black American soldiers began to play itself out when they were in Britain. 2.5 million Americans crossed the North Atlantic to live in Britain, sometimes with British families. They went to pubs in the evening, and of course, particularly Southern Americans had no tradition of socializing with black Americans, so there was conflict and confrontation there. The British found this completely curious that the Americans had these attitudes. So the segregation of units into transport units and support units, and as you mentioned, the balloon brigades, these were all a component of the American military that the British simply could not get their heads around.
And the balloon brigade, as I understand it, were balloons that were rigged to fight it so that if the German pilots hit them, that they were in deep trouble?
They're very small dirigibles, barrage balloons they're called, that are connected to the ships by a cable. And the idea was to prevent German aircraft from strafing the beach because they would become entangled in cables and or the barrage balloons themselves.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor. Before we go, we have an update on the disturbing state of affairs in Sudan, where peaceful pro-democracy demonstrators have been met with violence from Sudan's Transitional Military Council. The military council has been in control of the country since its longtime dictator, Omar al-Bashir, was ousted in April. And since June 3rd, at least 30 people were killed and more than 100 injured when they were shot and beaten by Sudan's military junta. Now, this happened while they were taking part in peaceful sit-ins in the capital city of Khartoum. The country's mobile internet was also briefly shut down in what was some viewed as an attempt to cut off the main method of organization for the country's pro-democracy protesters. Protest leaders have called for demonstrations to continue. Sudan's military council has promised to hold internationally supervised elections within 7 months and says it will form an interim government to prepare for the elections. We will have to wait to see if this promise is kept. We'll keep you updated on the story as it develops. That's all the time we have for today. Stay plugged in by liking us on Facebook at Voice of America. You can also like my Facebook page at facebook.com/Greta and follow me on Twitter at Greta. Thank you for being plugged in.
We make a difference when we unmask terror, when we explain the impossible, when we confront an uncertain future, when we give voice to the voiceless. The difference is freedom of the press. We are the voice of America, where free press matters.